Okay, right. I'm sorry. I forgot to hit the button starting the broadcast. I'm sitting here talking to myself in an empty screen going, "Where is everybody? Where is everybody?" Okay. It was an old man error, not technology, Riley. See, it was the old man goofing up again. How does this thing work? Oh my goodness. Yes, we do have a review session occurring at 2 p.m. on Friday. I am super duper sorry because I've got plans Friday night and I will not be able to be here for the evening review session. Um, cool. You're all dead, huh? I know, Leanne, we're getting towards the end of the semester. It's crunch time. You've got exams coming up. You've got papers coming up, right? I'm sure you high school students are super duper stressed too because you've got another level of school bureaucracy to deal with. Good, good, good. I'm glad the Friday 2 p.m. time works for you. Good deal. You have math class. Oh, I'm sorry for that, Etta. I do apologize. It's the Winter World Series, and I will be umpiring somewhere around the state on Friday evening. So I've got to take off about 4 o'clock to go wherever I'm going. Cool. Hopefully you will take the exam after the review. I will put the review PowerPoint slides up for you, and you'll be able to watch the review as a recording at us. So hopefully it'll be okay. And of course, if you want to ask me questions, we can get into a Teams meeting and have a chat anytime during the weekend. Okay. It's course evaluation this week. I know, right? I'm feeling the same way, Aaron. All this election stress is getting me. Right? Open your eyes. Yeah, right. I know I like the abuse, Mike. There's nothing like having people yell at me all evening long. It's good for the ego. I feel it's kind of like running or lifting weights or boxing. You know, having somebody beat on you just makes you a little bit tougher. Military training. Cool. Let's see. You'll come heckle me the whole time. Fantastic. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started if we can. So let me go ahead and click on my PowerPoint so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about the second part of Chapter 12. Remember, we're talking about social psychology, which is the influence that real or imagined people have on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And I was talking about the person as a function of the group. On Tuesday, I talked about group identity and I talked about attributional styles. What I'd like to do today is talk about how people influence our behavior. And we're going to be talking about this magical invisible stuff called social influence, which is the power that other people have to shift your behaviors one way or the other. We're going to talk about attitude formation. I'm going to talk about one specific theory of attitude formation called cognitive dissonance. And then we're going to talk a little bit about applications of social influence that have been shown in the history of social psychology. So, is everybody ready to get started today? Give me a chat up if you're ready to go. No. Okay. So, social psychologists are very interested in attitudes. Maybe not so specifically attitudes, but about changing attitudes. That is, persuading people and changing people's attitudes and behavior. Now, I'm going to mention this a couple of times today, but World War II and psychology's interaction in World War II is incredibly important, and sort of the events and the applications and the need for social psychology in the 1940s around World War II really changed and caused the field to blossom as a scientific subfield and area of interest. And social psychology contributed to the World War II effort in two fundamental ways. Number one, we were involved in helping understand how a group of people, a society, the German people, could engage in such a systemic violation of people's human rights. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the other area in which social psychology was very important was in helping the war effort by helping the military craft very persuasive messages. So none of us are familiar with this, but during the World War II, there was a need for people in the United States to change their behavior, to use less sugar, to use less rubber, to conserve things, to buy war bonds. And the government needed to shift lots of people's opinions on these topics and cause behaviors to occur. Just like we have PSAs now, which tell us not to pollute or to save energy or to treat ourselves healthy. The government at this time, this was when the use of the PSA was really coming into its own, and social psychologists helped the government craft persuasive messages that would effectively communicate the needs and desires of the government to the people. So that's sort of where social psychology really came into its own. Now, they were interested in this thing we'll call an attitude. Now, an attitude is a relatively enduring set of beliefs, feelings, and behavioral tendencies towards an object, event, or symbol. And you'll notice in parentheses, I've got cognition, affect, and behavior in parentheses. When we talk about an attitude isn't so much an emotion, although they may be related, but an attitude is an orientation towards an object, event, or symbol. And you can demonstrate that attitude through the way you think about that object. So there are positive attitudes and negative attitudes that we can positive thoughts and negative thoughts that we can have about an object which convey an attitude. There are feelings that we have towards an object that convey an attitude, and we can behave towards an object in such a way that it conveys an attitude. In fact, let me give you an example right here. Let's go over to our attitude structure. So attitudes are cognition, affect, and behavior. And I'm going to use this to explain a Trump supporter. I am not necessarily a Trump supporter, but I decided to use the counterfactual to keep myself from getting too excited and political, right? So if you think about the average Trump supporter, they have a belief about Trump that is positive. Typically, my dad's a Trump supporter, and he tells me that Trump is a good businessman. That's a belief. That's a piece of knowledge, a piece of information about Trump, but it conveys an attitude. Now, I think Trump is a bad businessman. Now, that's my own thought or cognition about him, and it conveys a different attitude than does my dad. Now, there's also the affect. This is sort of the warm feeling amygdala part of the attitude. My dad gets warm fuzzies and feels American when he sees Trump's picture. On the other hand, I do not get warm fuzzies when I see his picture. So we both have a different sort of feeling towards President Trump. And then my dad and I differ in our behavior. So my dad's going to vote for him, which conveys a certain attitude about Trump. And I'm going to vote against him, not necessarily for Biden, but against him. And that conveys my attitude towards him. So in a sense, you can talk about an attitude as sort of being this multiple part of our frontal lobe, the cognition, the amygdala, the affect, right, and then our subsequent behaviors. Now, because attitudes are so multifaceted, it's really difficult to figure out when sometimes parts of these attitudes may not be consistent. And so one of the questions that social psychologists often ask is, if you know somebody's attitude about an object, can you predict their specific behavior towards that object? Because sometimes people are not really consistent in their attitudes and their behaviors. Some of you may say that you care about the environment, and yet you still drink out of plastic water bottles and throw them away every day, right? Some of us believe in the fair distribution of wealth, and yet we may hoard money and not give to the homeless when we see them, right? So the weird thing is sometimes our attitudes don't measure up with our behaviors. And one of the questions that social psychologists have asked is, can you really see consistency between the behavioral component of a person's attitude and their affective and cognitive parts of the attitude? And the research says it depends. It depends. It depends. The more specific the attitude statement is, the more likely it is to predict a behavior. So my statement that I care about the environment is pretty general and pretty abstract, but I can convey that attitude in any number of specific behaviors. If you really want to predict my behavior based upon my stated attitude, you need to be more specific in the attitude that you ask. So we all, expected one thing from the polls that came out last week. We didn't expect a close political race at all. And some people say, how can the polls be wrong? If you think about it, a poll is a statement of your cognitive or affective belief of your attitude, and the vote is the actual behavior. And sometimes they don't even up. So if you tell me, hey, do you favor Trump or Biden? I might say, I favor Biden. But maybe I might have to cast a vote for another reason for Trump. So you have to make sure that the attitude that you measure, the cognitive component, is as specific as the behavior you intend to measure. Does that make sense? Okay, now, the more easy it is to access the attitude. So I think about freedom and civil liberties all day long. That attitude pops up. Anytime a thought comes into my mind or I hear about something, civil liberties and political freedom may pop into my mind as a liberal, right? And so it's easy for me to access that attitude. We have attitudes about lots of things, but those attitudes aren't always available to us. Remember, we talked about schemas, and when you think about objects, schemas are the associations. Well, some attitudes are more easily associated with the things we think of than other attitudes. So all of you have an attitude on bananas, right? But you don't think about that attitude a lot. It's not as accessible. So the easier it is to access an attitude, the more likely it is to predict your behavior. And the opposite of number one, if your attitude is general, then you need to measure specific instances of my behavior, and then those general instances may predict my behavior, right? So if you ask me, do you care about the environment? And I say yes, well, don't just measure whether or not I drink out of a plastic water bottle, but measure lots of different things. Do I drive a green car? Do I live in a green house? Do I have solar panels on my house? Do I wear used clothes? You might ask lots of different behaviors. So you either have to make the attitude more specific or measure more behaviors. And then typically you're going to be more likely to see consistency between people's cognitive and behavioral components of their attitude. We're going to talk about consistency in a little bit, okay? So, is everybody following me so far? I'm not paying attention to the chat bar. I hope I'm doing okay. I used to hate bananas, but now I love them. There you go. You've changed that attitude. Very interesting. Do attitudes change? Can we change attitudes? Right? And you know what? Sometimes we're not even aware of our attitudes. I mentioned this on Tuesday. I'm going to mention it again today. Please go to Project Harvard and test your implicit attitudes. The weird thing is that attitudes are cognitive structures. You may not even be aware of the associations that you have with a particular minority group, or a particular association you might have about males and females and cultural beliefs that you may possess that you are not even aware of. Project Implicit allows you to measure these implicit attitudes that we're not aware of that do affect our behavior. Okay, so you might find out you have a preference for one minority group or against a minority group. You might find that you're very old school and very very sexist in your beliefs towards women in industry or science. And so, because I could mix up the letters, right? It's kind of a difficult test, and it requires you to be quick but to be right. And you have to hit the left and the right keys. And they either put the word, the stereotypic word with the image, or on the opposite side of the screen is the image. And the faster, and it measures how quickly you can make the judgment. Typically, if you have a strong association, you'll make a quicker judgment when the word and the stereotypic image are on the same side. It's a really cool way to measure your implicit attitudes. So when we talk about attitudes, social psychologists are really interested in how people's attitudes change. And we've got behavioral models, cognitive models, and social models. And we're going to talk about each of these three models in turn a little bit. So, with regard to behavioral models, remember in Chapter 6 we talked about behaviorism, and I talked about classical conditioning, and I talked about operant conditioning. And in fact, in the behavioral chapter, I even talked about higher order conditioning. And I think I had an example about Michael Jordan being able to sell Hanes underwear. That's an example of classical conditioning. And advertisers are very interested in changing our attitudes towards products in the hope that our beliefs and our feelings will spur our behavior based on that attitude. So I want you to like Chanel cologne, which is the affective part of the attitude, so that you will engage in the behavioral component of that attitude, buying the cologne. And so the old school behaviorists did have a great idea on how we could on how attitude could be changed using operant and classical conditioning. So we'll talk about those briefly. Sort of the most interesting one is the mere exposure effect. You ever notice that sometimes you just see tons and tons and tons of commercials of the same product, and you say, wow, that's kind of boring. Why are they showing me that commercial over and over and over and over again? It turns out that there's this thing called the mere exposure effect. Typically, the more you see something, the more favorable your opinion is going to get to it, if you have an initially positive view. Now, down right below me, you'll see a picture of Meghan Merkel. And they have a really cool experiment to demonstrate this. On the left side of your screen is the reverse image of Meghan Merkel. It's what she would see if she were looking in a mirror. And on the right side is the picture that you would see if you take a picture of her from the outside. So it's the version of her that we all see. And what they do in these experiments is they'll take a picture of you, just like they do of her, and either show you the mirrored image or the image that other people see. And it turns out that people, when they're asked to judge which picture they think is more attractive, people tend to like the mirrored image of themselves better than the regular image of themselves. Why is that? That's because you never see yourself from the third point of view. You're always looking at yourself in a mirrored image. So the more you more somebody sees something or is exposed to something, the more favorable their opinion is going to be. Exactly. They do the same thing, Chris, with the ads, the advertisement. They just hit you on and on and on. And the idea is if you hear Cal Cunningham or Tom Tillis's name enough times, you will like them and vote for them. But just remember, there's this thing called environmental spoiling. If the initial attitude is negative, it turns out that more exposure will actually work the opposite way. So for me personally, people are different. The more times I hear Donald Trump's name, the less I like him. And that's because my initial attitude was negative. I actually had a Department of Education grant and went to Washington, D.C. to meet with congressional staffers, and I met Tom Tillis's people, and they were the only Republican staffers we met, and they were actually the nicest ones to us. So I refused to say anything mean about Tom Tillis because his staff was really nice, whereas some of the other staffers were a little more dismissive, right? Okay. Boom. So there you go. Now, classical conditions. Remember, I suggested to you that you can positively associate an attractive person or success with your object, and the positivity that people feel towards attractive person will be washed over onto your product. So they have a picture of Brad Pitt here with Chanel number 5. And the idea is I really like Brad Pitt. And I will associate that positive experience that I feel by seeing Brad Pitt with the Chanel cologne. And I will like that cologne even a little bit more. And then you know what? They're in the 40s and 50s, they even looked at the number of rewards that you could put in a message and found that people responded more to rewarding messages, and people could often be be negatively reinforced too. You could tell them, if you don't engage in this behavior, you will get cavities, you will get sick, you will do this. And so operant conditioning, both positive and negative reinforcers in a message, will work to change people's attitudes. Okay? Now, the weird thing is, though, sometimes people use things that don't really make sense to come to their opinions and their attitudes. And just like the cognitive tradition sort of invaded everything else, the cognitive tradition invaded the study of attitudes and persuasion. And what I'd like for you to look at right now is what's known as the elaboration likelihood model. You know what? Sometimes when we look at people, and here's the thing, I've listened to some of Donald Trump's speeches, and I don't necessarily hear sometimes the policy things that I want to hear. I don't hear what I would call relevant messages. Instead, I hear things that sort of make me just feel quick associations. Waving a flag, using the word patriot, you know what I mean? Using buzzwords. And I sometimes wonder, how is it some people are persuaded by things like a flag and a flyover, which aren't really related to the task at hand, and yet sometimes they want to listen to the messages and the details and the policy. So the question is, why do some people develop their attitudes based on thoughtful components, and why do other people base their attitudes on less than thoughtful components? And here's the thing, we all do this. All of us do this. Sometimes when we form our attitudes, we elaborate. We really think about the pros and cons of the opinion we are asked to have. And sometimes we just look at whether or not the person is an expert or attractive or talks a lot, right? And so sometimes we really elaborate the persuasive messages we receive, and sometimes we don't elaborate the persuasive messages we receive and come to our attitudes based on superficial characteristics. Does that make sense? You know what? Right, Kirchhoff. Sometimes when I look at a political message, I don't really look at the message itself. I look at who's sending the message. If it's a conservative group, maybe I don't believe it as much. If it's a liberal group, maybe I believe it. Now, depending upon where it comes from, does that necessarily mean it's true or not true, right? So if you're a conservative, is a story on CNN necessarily a lie? Or if you're a liberal like myself, is a story on Fox necessarily a lie? Too often, people will make their judgment and have their attitude on who's telling the story rather than listening to the information in the story. Does that make sense? That's the difference between high elaboration and low elaboration. Does that make sense? Now, the weird thing is, Petty and Cacioppo, the Ohio State researchers who kind of created and developed this model, they suggested they could tell you when people were going to use high elaboration or low elaboration strategies. How do people respond to persuasive messages? It depends on two factors. Is the person able to process the information? All right. And is the person motivated to process the information? Now, here's the thing. Coming to a decision about who will be the best president requires you to understand geopolitical, economic, social, demographic factors. If you think about it, really, when you try to decide who would be the best leader, it's a really, really, really complicated decision. And if you're just going to dismiss Donald Trump for one reason or dismiss Joe Biden for one reason, you really are not thinking deeply. It's a very complicated process, right? And who's president really, really and so it's a really complicated process. So sometimes when people are overwhelmed, they will switch to persuasion cues. Only when they are able to process the information will they think deeply about their attitudes. Now, think about this. In a court case, sometimes you will get a group of people who may have to decide an antitrust lawsuit. I don't even really know what antitrust lawsuits are. It's so complicated and lawyerly. But if you get a bunch of people with high school diplomas and they're asked to make a judgment in this antitrust case, they may have to hear days and weeks of legal wrangling that they don't understand because they don't have the proper training. Those people don't have the ability to process. They're going to use persuasion cues or peripheral cues. All right? On the other hand, sometimes we're motivated or not motivated. So for me, I am really, really motivated about who's going to be the president of the United States because it personally affects me, I think. It really, really matters to me. And if you folks are like me, you probably feel the same way. But what about when you get down to county commissioner? How many of you really care about the county commissioner's race? Let's be honest here. Do we really care? Do we really care? No, we don't. So then what do? I make my judgment based on similarity, just like most of you. I'll pick the group, the political group that's me. So in general, if I don't know any better, I will pick the Democrat. My wife, if she doesn't know, generally she will pick the female. And this is sort of what they call the down ballot effect that you will see in political races. You may think deeply about why you do or do not want Joe Biden or Donald Trump to be president, but we really don't think about lieutenant governor, agricultural secretary, agricultural commissioner. We don't care. And so we're not motivated. So what Eagley and Shaken showed is that really, unless people have the ability and the motivation to process, they are really not going to focus on the arguments in the discussion. They are instead going to use peripheral cues. What's a peripheral cue? Well, how attractive that source is, and not only physical attractiveness, but in terms of economic attractiveness. Are they going to are they talking about things that I'm familiar with? Do they talk about objects that I like? So you've got sort of these attractiveness qualities. Expertise. If somebody puts on a white lab coat or says that they're a professor of something, people automatically assume they're right. Not true, right? What if the person's similar to you? How many political ads show somebody who looks just like you? And the idea is you're supposed to see that they're similar and you're supposed to accept their conclusions. You know what? Sometimes if somebody just talks for a long time, you will say, well, they must be right. They talked so long, they must have a good argument, right? And you know what? Sometimes you'll see that they'll put, like, so the Democrats, I noticed this, the Republicans would find that minority Trump supporter and put them on. And you hear this person who typically is arguing against what people think is their self-interest. And it makes you think, wow, maybe that person is right. Maybe I'm wrong. On the other hand, Joe Biden might put a farmer or a military guy or somebody you would typically expect to be a Trump fan and have that person talk about how good Biden is. So in a sense, talking against their self-interest. So all of these are cues which don't really have anything to do with the quality of the argument, but they can affect your final opinion. So, does it make sense how sometimes we think deeply about our attitudes and sometimes we just focus on whether or not the person has a nice suit? right? Okay. All right, let's move on just a little bit. You know what? And the weird thing is, sometimes, right? Sometimes, if you can get somebody to buy into something and to engage in a behavior that's inconsistent with their attitudes or values, because they can't take the behavior back, they will change their values to fit their behavior. Now, what I'm going to argue, and you know what, I will even argue in 2016 when President Trump was elected, I was ready to give him a chance because I've always been that kind of person. Hey, we got our turn for 8 years, time to give the Republicans a turn for 4 years. I was really ready to accept him. Now, some people were more excited about Trump and had bought into him and really supported him. And then the thing is, he keeps doing things that are sort of against your values. So you may have followed him because he was a strong political leader, but then he spoke out and it sounded like he was supporting white supremacy. Well, you've already said you support him once. If you turn on him now, you look like an inconsistent person. So you say, you know what, I accept Donald Trump, even though he sort of said that thing about the Charlottesville people. And so now I have this attitude. Now I've accepted Trump once because I thought he was a political genius. And you know what? I kind of swept that other thing under the rug and I accepted him now. Now he does something that's even a little more outrageous. Now, can I change my opinion? No, I can't really change my opinion because it's inconsistent with this behavior. I've already posted on Facebook. I've already posted on social media. I would look like a fool if I change my attitude now. And so what happens is because somebody you engage in a behavior and you state that behavior, people don't like a feeling of inconsistency. Even though the behaviors and attitudes, sometimes their behaviors and thoughts are inconsistent, people don't like it. So what happens is you actually will move your attitude, which you can change to fit with the behavior which you've already banked. Does that make sense? So this guy Leon Festinger demonstrated this for the first of many times way back in 1957. He brought people into the laboratory and he gave them the most incredibly boring task to do for an hour as part of a psychology experiment. They just took a peg and they turned it 1/4 turn this way clockwise, then another turn clockwise, then another turn clockwise, all the way till it went all the way around, and then they turned it back 4 clicks. And they did that experiment for an entire hour. Do you know how freaking boring it would be to turn a peg for an hour? These people had to have hated their job. At the end, he told them, you know what? I need you to stay. He broke it up into 3 groups. 1/3 of the group, he said, you know what? I need you to stay and tell these next people how much fun this task is so they'll help me with this experiment. I'll give you $1 if you do that for me. So he asked people to do that task, but he only paid them $1. Another 1/3 of the group, he said, you know what? I need you to stay and tell these other people how exciting this next task is. I'll give you $20 to do that. And 1/3 of the people, he didn't ask them to recommend the task at all. Now, after he asked these people, and of course the people 1s and 2s agreed, afterwards he asked them to rate how much they liked the task. And what he found was the people who were not paid much to like the task, who were paid just $1 to say they liked it, really reported liking the task later. But those people who were asked to recommend the task but were paid a ton of money, they were easily able to say, well, I said that lie because I was paid a lot of money. And it turns out that their opinion towards the task was very, very negative. They just wanted the money, Leanne, exactly, and they could justify their behavior. Could you imagine having to do that for an entire hour, Riley? And then you have to tell somebody, oh yeah, that's fun, right? And you're asked to do it and you're not really paid to do it. If you're paid to do it, you can laugh later and say, ha, I was just taking advantage of them suckers. But not so much, right? And so this is sort of an interesting way to show how people's attitudes sometimes develop this sort of weird hardwired consistency. Right? And you know what? I will find some of my Democratic friends, my more progressive friends, have this same intransigence of attitudes. They don't change their attitudes like they should. right? Now, let's talk specifically about social influence. It's this invisible power that we have over other people to affect their behavior. All right, it's the power that other people have to change our behavior. Now, your book's going to talk about conformity, compliance, or obedience as if they're different things. They're just social influence in different situations. Social influence is the power that presence of other people have to cause us to act and sometimes not to act, but just the effect that people have over our behavior. And I don't really worry so much about conformity, compliance, or obedience. Those are just different scenarios where people demonstrate social influence. Why is this important? Well, it became really important to American scientists after World War II because a lot of these social psychologists, who in fact were Jewish, were very interested in understanding how the Nazi people could perpetrate such a systemically horrible and moral violating behavior. Was there something wrong with the German people? Did they have some sort of cultural flaw? Or, which would actually, in one sense, be comforting because we could then point to those people and say, hey, they are wrong. But you know what? What these social psychologists found is that the Nazis were subject to the same exact forces that you and I are subject to. And just because Nazis occurred once in Germany doesn't mean that horrible, immoral behavior can't occur in any other place, including the United States. Okay, so what they showed really is how banal or how average and humdrum violence and immorality really is. Okay, yes, that's exactly the experiment we're going to talk about, Michael, in just a second. Now, I like to think of influence as falling into two categories, what I'll call normative influence and informational influence. You know what? It's okay to follow other people's lead when you don't know what you're doing, right? You go to a fancy restaurant, you go to a new job, what do? You look around and see what other people are doing and adapt your behavior. Let's call that informational influence. Sometimes we read our environment to understand what the proper behavior is. Sometimes we are influenced because we want to be right. On the other hand, sometimes you know what the right answer is, but you do the wrong thing. Come on, Billy, have a sip of this beer. Well, I don't think that's right. My mom and dad wouldn't like that. Oh, come on, Billy, you want to be cool like the rest of us? Okay. Right? That's what we call normative influence, right? And that's when we do things to fit in with the group, right? Normative influence. Right? Aaron, it's my best. Okay, so the normative influence. So let's think about that. And every time you've ever been influenced, you can put it into one of these two categories. Let's talk about two, right? So peer pressure, I swear to God, I have a friend, even today, 50 years old. He's always engages in this social pressure for drinking. Every time I go over there, hey man, you want a beer? No, I'm cool. It's 3 in the afternoon. I'm cool. Come on, man, have a beer. Come on, you sure you don't want a beer? And I'm like, dude, no. I'm having a beer. That's fine. Everybody has beer. Fine, dude. I'm 50, and yet he'll still do that. It's so it doesn't go away, Leanne. Now, two very important studies, one which I think demonstrates normative influence and one which I think demonstrates informational influence. Yes, it never changes. And if you're a teenager and your mom or dad makes fun of you for falling prey to peer pressure, I guarantee you they do the same thing when they go to work. We all fall into that normative influence pressure. Absolutely. Peer pressure is a thing, Mike. Funny. So let's talk about two very famous studies. The first is Solomon Asch's line judging study. There had been some earlier research about this thing called the autokinetic effect, which I'm not going to talk about, demonstrating that people sometimes conform their judgments in an ambiguous situation. And the fellow who demonstrated the autokinetic effect said, you know what, look at this. This shows that people conform to peer pressure. And Solomon Asch said, no, you're looking at what people do when they're uncertain. When people are certain of the right answer, they will not conform to peer pressure. And so he set up this cool experiment where he was going to demonstrate that people were not falling for prey to peer pressure. And so he brought a person into an experiment, a social psych experiment, and he said, hey, we're having sort of this sensory perception experiment, and you and these 5 other people sitting here are all going to be making line judgments. All right. Now, what the participant didn't know was that all the other students were Confederates. They were working for the experiment. That's a term we use to explain people who look like they're not with the experimenter, but who are helping to create an experimental situation. We use a lot of Confederates in social psychology. Now, these Confederates were instructed on some of the trials to give a clearly incorrect answer. And they set it up so that the 5 Confederates went first and the real participant went last. And the question was, would the real participant say something that was clearly wrong? Okay, so here's the example of the task. They would say, which line is the same length as the reference line? It is clear that number 2 is the correct answer. But on given trials, everybody would say 3 or 1. And then they would record what the person did. And what they found was that people were willing to agree with a clearly incorrect majority at least 1/3 of the time. Now, did these people, were they really deluded into believing this? They reran the experiment and had the participant come in late, and they said, you know what, since you're late, we're not going to let you speak with the rest of the people. We're going to have you sit here in this back room and write your judgments down. And it turns out that when the person's judgment was private, not public, they never, ever agreed with the incorrect majority. So these people were clearly agreeing with an incorrect majority in order to be accepted, to fit in with the group, right? And so that's an example of normative influence. Now, an even more dark finding was demonstrated by a fellow named Stanley Milgram, a Jew from New York City and a scientific researcher who was interested in understanding whether or not what had happened to the Jewish people could happen to anybody. So, in the Nuremberg trials, a lot of these people who were convicted and sentenced to death because of their behavior had the common defense that they were just following orders. They were just following orders. They were just following legal orders. And the Nuremberg court denied this defense and convicted all of these people. But Stanley Milgram wanted to know, could people really be coerced into doing something that bad on the advice of a legitimate authority? So he brought people into a laboratory and he told them that they and another person were going to be participating in a shock learning experiment. Now, what the participant didn't know was that the other person was a Confederate working for the experiment. And they flipped a coin and set it up so that the participant was always the teacher and the Confederate was always the learner. And then what they would do is they would take them to a big, scary-looking shock machine that had switches that went from 30 volts all the way up to 450 volts. They shocked the participant right there with 100 volts so they could see how painful it was. And they then pretended to hook the learner up into the shock machine and put them in another room. And then the real participant was put in this room and told to shock the person every time they made a mistake with the learning experiment, and they were supposed to increase the severity of the shocks from 30 volts all the way up to 450 volts, about 20 different switch flips. And they set it up so that they had recordings of the learner complaining and asking to be let out. And what happened was every time the learner in the room's recording would say, "Please let me out," the experimenter dressed in a white lab coat would tell the teacher, "It's your responsibility. Please continue. You must continue." And so really, every time the teacher didn't want to keep shocking the person, The experimenter would tell them they had to. And the question was, how many people would go all the way up to the most severe shock, labeled as triple X dangerous? And it turns out that over 2/3 of the people that they recruited were willing to shock another person all the way up. And actually, they set it up so that the person quit making a noise after 300 volts. And this person still, they were asked to take no answer as an incorrect answer. And so they had people actually flip the switch 6 or 7 more times, even after a person stopped talking. So in a sense, they demonstrated that the average person can be coerced into doing something that violates their normals, hurting another person. Now, I would argue that this is informational influence, because these people, when they talked, they made sure that they gave up responsibility. It's not my job. I was just doing what the doctor was telling me to do. And so a lot of people really, in a sense, believed the professor, the doctor, when they said that what you're doing is not a bad thing. Okay. Oh, it looks like I'm breaking up now. Okay. It's a little bit better. Yes, that is kind of screwed up. Okay. And so that's an example, in my opinion, of informational influence. And one of the things that I think we ought to be aware of as people, and this is on the left and the right, is to be careful of the authorities you follow and the beliefs that you have, because a lot of times these beliefs are shaped by forces in our social environment that we are not aware of. Crap. Is it getting better now? Okay, well, you know what? That's all I had to say. Uh, Anyhow, I am completely done for the day. Thank you very much.